It's really hard to talk about that for one, but I see with my brother, there has been it is the same heart of going to these standards, putting up all of these outward things to make your heart look good before others. And I think that is really why I wrote this book, was in that time when my brother was about to be arrested.
Hey everyone, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. It's Tuesday, March 28th, 2023, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. I am so glad to have you back here. Jinger Duggar Volo has done yet another interview, this time with Allie Beth Stuckey. And in this interview, she spoke a little bit more about her brother Josh and the culture that they grew up in and what she felt like contributed to where he sees himself today. And it's the most in-depth I've heard her speak about her brother. And it also kind of gives an insight into sort of Jeremy's thoughts and their thoughts about Josh, about what contributed to the situation where we see Josh. And obviously, we know that there are so many people that have been impacted by what Josh has done, but the fact that he is a product of a culture that really suppresses human emotions and natural attractions, along with this idealization of being perfect. And if you are perfect, you'll get to God. And as long as you look perfect, you will get to God. Jinger sort of dove into that in this interview, which really, I think, has been the number one component of people discussing Josh and the IBLP together. Now, in the interview, which Allie Beth has uploaded onto her YouTube channel and onto her podcast, they talk about a long list of different topics related to Bill Gothard that we've covered so much on this channel and in my coverage. And I think it really goes into question about when she speaks about Josh, her concern is that people are viewing Josh as a Christian and that Josh represents all of Christianity, and that critics will go after all Christianity as an issue for Josh.
I was looking at all of this and I was thinking, man, the glory of God is just, it's going to be dragged through the dirt because people think this is what it is. He's claimed to be a Christian.
Yeah.
And he had up all these outward things that made him look good. But when everything falls apart and no one's saying anything, we have to speak up for the glory of God. And so that's where I thought we want to make a distinction between putting on rules and what the heart of true Christianity is, that we're not going to.
And so her rationalization for writing this book was sort of a defense of Christianity and to admonish the teachings that they grew up in. And I do think that some critics have been critical of Christianity. I think most people that cover this are more interested in the IBLP, and they understand that what Gothard is doing is not Christian. It's a cult. So her book, which does dive into a lot of the negative teachings of Gothard, really does just scratch the surface. And this interview, I feel like, goes in much deeper into how suppressed people are when they're inside of this group. How many families just end up going back to Gothard over and over and over again to fix their problems, and the problems never work because it's all superficial and there's no work that is done. So Josh is a complicated case, obviously, because yes, he grew up in this culture, but he also seems to have a personality disorder, which no amount of faith can fix. And, there's also a problem within this culture of the IBLP where they're not allowed to have any mental health help, which can exacerbate issues. So if you're never dealing with the root problem, and if you're only ever saying that God is the issue, God is the solution, yes, faith is helpful. But I think most Christians, at least that I speak to, that are following this channel, and you all know that I'm not a Christian, would tell you that God gives, they would tell me that God gives all kinds of gifts to people to use. And one of those gifts is therapy, doctors, medication, and all of these can be used to help someone in their life. So if you are one of those Christians that understands that the two of these things can exist together, I applaud you. Groups like Gothard, his was so divisive. He didn't want anyone to trust anyone but him, because all of those people, like doctors, like therapists, like psychologists, would threaten his ability to control and provide the solutions, which ultimately is what made him money. So let's dive into today's topic of Jinger Duggar speaks out a little bit more about Josh and what her thoughts are about this culture. Before we dive into today's topic, please do me a favor by clicking on the subscribe button below. Make sure to click on the bell if you'd like to get notified of any time new content is uploaded. If you have something to say, make sure to leave a comment. If you love these videos, share these videos with your friends. And if you want to help the channel, you can always click on the heart and give us thanks. So let's dive in. So Allie Beth Stuckey is obviously a podcaster that's also deeply within the Calvinistic faith, and she is someone that is a staunch defender of John MacArthur. So it's not shocking that Jinger and Jeremy would go back to Allie Beth. And setting aside what people's feelings are for Allie, I think that there is some value in what Jinger shares about the belief system and where it impacted her family. And I think it's easy for people to say when they listen to these things, like, we're not talking about her family, she's not naming names. When she grows up in this faith and her parents are still adhering to this belief system, she's talking about her experience, which includes her family. So she doesn't have to say their names for anybody to connect the dots, is all I'm trying to say. The beliefs are harmful, but it's Jim Bob Duggar who continues to believe in these things, refusing to let go of them because, in my opinion, it benefits him. So one of the biggest things that she said with this is that there is really a suppression of emotion, of doing the right things, but not having the ability to actually understand why you're doing things because you have to follow rules. And she and Jeremy started talking about why they wrote the book, and that's sort of where the conversation moves into Josh. Check it out.
And I think one of those things was, like, within Bill Gothard's setting, there's so much of that talk about purity, about keeping yourself pure, and almost viewing, like, even thinking about sex with your kids, or like all of that at appropriate ages, and like about how your bodies are changing, that is totally pushed out. So there's not even a healthy view of, like, okay, marriage is a gift from God that's to be enjoyed within marriage, or to be able to enjoy this. But there's such a focus on pushing out all of that as almost like evil, even attraction. There were so many.
An aspect I've always noticed in the wisdom books on Bill Gothard's, the curriculum that he was selling through the Advanced Training Institute, which was the children's side of the IBLP, they did discuss the anatomy of women and men and what it was like when you're in a marriage. But there really was no discussion about if you were of age, say 15, 16 years old, and whether or not you were attracted to someone. It wasn't allowed because they are taught that eyes can send messages and that clothing can send a message that can bring up unwanted feelings, and that every thought of lust is a lustful thought that's brought up from Satan, and that in order to please God, you can't have those feelings. But there's no distinction about how when you do grow up and you develop hormones and you go through puberty, that it becomes natural to actually be attracted to someone, and that you feeling an attraction to someone isn't Satan. It's natural part of the human experience. And everything is made to be evil. Even liking someone is evil, because boys and girls are not allowed to speak to each other, because they're not allowed to date, because everything becomes an evil thing that Satan can take hold of. And really all it does is paralyze people. And so children are not allowed to even explore their sexuality or even explore having feelings for people, which Ginger goes into a little bit further about how she would feel guilty even being attracted to people, or that taking vows of having to be single so that you don't think about these things, which again suppresses emotion. And anytime you suppress emotion, in my opinion, and feelings like this, the human is going to have to find their own ways to figure out things. And it might, because there's no boundaries, make people go to the extreme.
There were so many focuses on like, okay, now we have to make these single service commitments. Bill Gothard was big into that. He would push these single service commitments to God. And you would have 20-year-olds making these commitments for 10 years. You'd have young kids who were making it, older people making it for 10 years. And it was like, what are we doing here?
Commitments to...
He would have them make a commitment to not get married for 10 years, not get married for 5 years so you can focus on the Lord without distraction. If you're young and you're like 15, okay. Like if it's 5 years, 10 years, whatever, like that's okay. When you are 30 and you're making single service commitments, there's a problem there. He wanted them to abstain from thinking about another person they're attracted to. So that almost was looked at as sin. Like if you have attraction, I would feel guilty if I was attracted to a young man who was godly, who had good character. I would feel so guilty, and I would never talk to my sisters about it because I was like, that's almost sinful.
So in an effort to control the youth and to gain their loyalty and their work, because what better way to get people to work for you than to bring in young people that are, committing themselves to Jesus. And you can say, I'm going to have you come work at my institute as an intern, which he did a lot. And they commit to being single, and then they go work for him, which then gives him access to those young people. And so she's saying, he's having them commit to don't even think about it and just be single, and therefore you'll just be with God. But the human brain doesn't work like that. And if you tell someone that they have to make a vow to be single, and then they can't keep hold of that, it does create a situation where people feel like liking someone, being attracted to someone, having thoughts of fondness for someone is evil. And he would say they fall into rebellion, which is akin to witchcraft, and then you're open to Satan's attacks. So again, he's telling people to suppress their emotions. But the truth is that he used this as a technique to get people, young people, to work for him, volunteer for him. Don't go out and date. Dedicate your life to me. I had a friend of the Duggars say that they were at an event with him, Gothard, in a group of girls, young girls, like 14, 13, saying, I have an idea. Instead of going out and dating, why don't you commit your years to the Institute in Basic Life Principles? Come work at the Chicago, headquarters. They did things like mail, they shipped out tracts, they printed things. He got free labor out of it. They held conferences where they worked. And so then he also got access to young girls that were working for him. And I remember the friend said to me, when I saw him asking young girls to dedicate his time and energy and get their parents to agree to have them come work for him in Chicago, I kept thinking, this man wants these kids near him. And what better way to do it? And that was sort of a signal to a lot of people that he was preying on young people. But it's all designed to make people think that they're doing this for God. It's sick. And then you have everyone that follows him following that same model so they can control people below them the same way. It's a cyclical pattern.
So you go to this purity culture and think this is how I'm going to glorify God. And the problem with that is when nothing's talked about, there's going to be curiosity there. Kids will get around anything that you put up for them. So having natural discussions is healthy at appropriate times
Yeah.
with your kids. And I think that was totally missing from Bill Gothard's teaching and that whole setting. And so it's so sad to see how many families, like, their kids would just figure everything out for themselves.
Yeah.
And I think he saw the more, well, the approach was to suppress, and we just suppress, we push away, and it actually increased the desire and the longing, which is why I stepped into that community and was caught off guard as well by the amount of times I was hearing cases of kind of gross sexual perversion in that community, saying, why is this happening? And
So in Josh's case, if you're listening to what they're saying, and this conversation is about Josh, that's how this conversation started. Every conversation about human sexuality is suppressed. All feelings, all thoughts, all emotions, all attractions are evil. Everything is bad, including magazines that have bathing suits. You can't look at a woman. You can't look at a man. You can't look at anyone. And as Jinger said, a kid will get around that and they will find a way to learn it themselves. And then what happens is that they have no one to teach them what is good versus bad, what is a healthy boundary, because they don't have any boundaries. They're told everything is bad, don't do any of it. And when you are told everything is bad and don't do any of it, you're going to want it more, especially teenagers, at least in my opinion. And as Jeremy said, he was shocked to learn and hear about people having very perverse interests of the nature of getting with someone. And I've talked to a lot of women that when they get into marriage that were part of this culture that have described their first time with their spouse as being SA'd, like as marital SA, because of how brutal it was, how the man felt so entitled because that's what they're told their whole life. So you have this suppression, but you also have a culture where victims aren't believed. Gothard said that there are no victims, that it's always the victim who is the one at fault. And so it creates not only suppression and which will then lead to no boundaries and intense interest in it, going to places where you can't even fathom. But then on top of that, it's male dominated and women are subservient. So it creates and fosters an imbalance, inequity in gender. So men feel entitled to do whatever they want to women and to children with no repercussions. And that's kind of how you find and see where Josh ends up, in my opinion.
you've got a sin problem as a person. You need Christ to transform you. And he was missing that. And so Ginger and I have talked a lot about the pain from the families in that culture, in that system, who do run into deep problems. There's pain because they keep going back to the same solution, but that's actually promoting the problem. And so they need to abandon Bill Gothard's proposed solution, and they need to go to the heart of the issue, which is a genuine relationship with Christ.
The thing is, it's the promised guarantees for success for your family. And so when they look at that, they're like, well, what principle did I violate?
Right.
So then they're just freaking out, really. They're not trusting God at all. It's just like, okay, me. What did I do? Where did I mess up? And so it's just really sad.
Yeah. I think there's
What I'm getting from what they're saying is that because of the system and that Bill Gothard promises that if you follow these rules, you will find success in your life, that people, when they run into issues because of the system, because of making everything bad, all attractions are bad, all feelings are bad, suppress. And then when they run into issues, they go to Gothard, who then just tells them that you have to do X, Y, and Z to fix it. And so you're doing all these outward things, thinking that you're doing what you need to do to fix it, but you're doing no work on the inside. Ginger and Jeremy spent a lot of time talking about transformation and regeneration, and that if you find God, you will somehow find balance. I think it's a little bit more complicated because in this system, yes, God is a great answer for a lot of things for people that believe in God. Unfortunately, people have to learn how to live and adapt in a world that they have not been taught how to be in. They have to relearn how to deal with making decisions without someone else telling them what to do, not having a roadmap, giving up that roadmap, giving up the success that he has promised them, giving up the belief system, giving up the community. It's very complicated. And then you have to deal with children that were poorly educated, that don't know how to navigate a world where they think that they can leave or do better because their parents have told them that they have to be underneath their authority. And if they don't, then they're rebelling, and it's akin to witchcraft. It's so much more complex than we just need to go find God. It's you have to disentangle from that whole cult system and excommunicate yourself from it, and then learn how to live in a society without those rules. And sure, you can find God, and sure, you can go and find Christianity, but it's deeper than that. And obviously, they can't explain that in a short interview, but if you understand what they're saying is that the Duggars have constantly been going back to Gothard to fix Josh. Josh keeps going back to Gothard to fix him, and he'll never be fixed because they're not dealing with the root problem. But for Josh, the root problem isn't that he has God. In my opinion, the root problem is that he was created in an environment that gave him no boundaries, that gave him entitled beliefs that he could have a woman and do anything that he wanted. And he had a father that constantly bailed him out and protected him because image matters and the prestige of the family name mattered. It's very complicated, but I think this gives a very deep insight into what happens with Josh and why he became who he became, and why so many men in this culture become this way. When you have no discussion about sexuality, when everything is bad, and when men can do whatever they want, it's going to breed disaster. And when victims aren't believed, it's going to create an environment where victims are silenced, men protect men, and perversion prevails because nobody talks about it. Josh Duggar continues to be in prison and will remain in prison for at least 9.5 more years. So tell me what your thoughts are about this in the comments below. Bye, guys.